Documentary's expanded so much.
Exactly.
I think the kind of work that I've been doing recently wouldn't have been called documentary 15 years ago, and now it fits within the umbrella of documentary.
No, it's exactly the same, I think. I still do trips on my credit card. I get some commissions and balance the two out.
The stories that people can tell to put with your visuals, I think can be a fantastic addition.
I no longer see a distinction really between going out and taking pictures of the world and going out and taking pictures from the world.
It's 25 years since Panos Pictures was founded as the commercial arm of the Panos Institute, an environment and development NGO. And it's that relationship that we have with the Panos Institute that has coloured what we've done over the last 25 years. The issues we choose to cover, our approach, the way we work. We sit between the not-for-profit world and the for-profit world, and it's that space that we occupy that makes us unique.
Where we were was much more working in a sort of single image environment, in a press environment. And this is a one-off.
The wall came down on 9th of November, and I remember that there were lots of photographers in London trying to get to Berlin at that time, and the flights were getting incredibly booked up, and then the price just escalated because all the staff photographers and the press agencies were throwing money over the counters to get their photographers out there. So I realised I wasn't going to make it. So I thought, I'll go at New Year. As I was walking down, approaching the Brandenburg Gate, you could see these letters Sa and Sa through some of the spaces in the columns. I thought, what? That can't be Saatchi and Saatchi. Is it possible, you know? It didn't appeal to me at all to be in a scrum of news photographers. I did it a few times, I hated it. What always appealed to me was being out on my own. And this kind of thing I got because I was not around other photographers. Very much somebody who likes to be out there documenting. I'm interested in history. You know? So.
Well, this is a piece of history.
That's it. It's a historic photo. I think that's what I feel about it. It is a piece of history, yeah. And I was very lucky to get it.
I can sort of hear the banter. It wasn't aggressive, but it was slightly jeering. This picture was taken in 1986, before the 87 general election. It was against a background of recession, post-miners' strike, post the big shake-up of the media with Murdoch at Wapping. When I look at that picture now, there's something wonderfully naive about it, in that is a Prime Minister in a controlled walkabout that was basically hijacked by real life. I couldn't take it today. For a still photographer to be able to stand back and get a clean picture of real people with a leading politician in a real world situation is practically impossible because of the pressures on A, the spin doctors, but B, the rolling 24-hour news. To actually see a politician that hasn't got 14 fluffy microphone boons under their noses is quite a rare thing.
Martin Adler was a Panos photographer who was tragically murdered in Somalia in 2006 by Islamic radicals. He once said, I want to go to the place where nobody else goes to, and I want to listen to the people that nobody else listens to. And that just about summed him up. And in that respect, he was very much a Panos photographer. When we began to work with him in the early 90s, he was one of the very few Panos photographers that did cover conflict. And as a result, was very, very important to us. There were many major events in the 90s, Chechnya, Rwanda, Sri Lanka, Liberia, endless events that he was the only Panos photographer at, which made him very key to our development as an agency. A large number of his photographs from conflict areas deal with the effect of conflict on civilian populations, and I can think of a number of pictures that really illustrate that very strongly. One he took in Liberia. He told me afterwards that he'd been in a building which was a firing point on the forward line in Monrovia, and he was coming down through the building photographing as he went, and he just came around a corner and there was a Liberian government fighter standing there just holding a baby. There's something very surreal about it. There's a weightlessness about it. There's a stillness as well. He's able to separate the action and just capture this moment, and in a way you don't know that there's a war raging outside the window. Another picture from Abkhazia where a woman is leaning against a wall. I'm not sure what she's doing. She might just be waiting for a bus, and next to her is a sleeping soldier, but they're totally unconnected, although they are within half a metre of each other. It's almost as if neither of them is aware of the other's presence. Unusually, Martin was shooting stills and video from very early on in his career, from the early 90s up until when he died. Nowadays that's fairly standard practice, but when he started, very, very few people did that, and he was able to deliver both to an exceptionally high standard. When he was in Liberia, he was working for Channel 4 making a feature whilst at the same time shooting stills for Aftonbladet, a Swedish newspaper. And in fact, during the time he was in Monrovia, which was under siege, he did the nightly reports back to London for Channel 4 News because they couldn't get anyone into the city. So he was kind of keeping several balls in the air at the same time.
Not only were there far less photographers in those days, but there were very few women photographers. So on the one hand, yeah, you have maybe one or two of the usual kind of battles as a woman, but it was also an advantage, really, and particularly in Kosovo, it was an advantage because I was working on my own and I could be in the back of the car going through police roadblocks, all this kind of stuff, and not really be noticed.
I think it's always an advantage being a woman, but, well, actually that hasn't been true all of my life, but I think it's got easier and easier. And definitely working as a photographer, I don't find it a disadvantage for all sorts of reasons. Sometimes because you're not taken so seriously, you're not so confrontational, you can often get behind the scenes easier. I think also you don't feel the pressure that you have to get the bang bang story, that you can go for the more background feature. There's one of a woman called Razia who's holding her wedding picture, and it was 1996 and it was really cold time in Kabul. Everyone was fearing that the Taliban were about to arrive, which was what happened a few months later. And Razia is one of the few people in the book who I've kept in regular contact with, and every time I meet her, and she's now older and older, I'm sort of aware of the passage of time and also the gulf between her and that picture taken when she wore her hair free, when she'd just got married. Her husband had since disappeared, presumed killed. When I first started photographing, I think in the early 80s, women weren't on the news agenda so much. Now, I think if reporters are covering a conflict, they will go for the women and children's story as well as the bang bang, the frontline stuff. I think that women have pushed to have women featured alongside the rest of the story.
Actually, going back 20 years, 25 years, there was less, certainly, construction of images within the broad area of photojournalism.
Was it a bit one-dimensional? And now you can't, that's not good enough?
With the benefit of hindsight, it's one-dimensional. We didn't think at the time, oh my God, this is one-dimensional. It's what we knew and what we did. But now we realise that there are so many more dimensions that you can work with in documentary and photojournalism.
And you have to be a bit more considered and conceptual, maybe.
Well, I think so, because so many things have been done before. Just because something's been done before is not an argument for not doing it again. But I think if you are going to do it again, you have a duty to try and do it differently.
Yeah. I mean, a good example of that is looking at Tim Hetherington's Liberia and the graffiti in Liberia. Now, we know that Tim did do some kind of more classic storytelling type photographs. But this edit, which he's very into himself, is the graffiti. And not only is that interesting because it is this whole idea of aftermath kind of photography, but without having the people in, but you have this very personal, because it is essentially handwriting or scarring of the walls. I mean, does that tell you more? I mean, that's, I guess the question is, how does that work when people...
Well, it does tell me more, because I have to use my imagination.
Yeah.
It's not like bang, bang, here's a dead body, here's something that's been blown up. I can I've seen all that before in a way, and I kind of know, okay, you just transfer, it transfers from one geographical position to another, but conflict is essentially conflict. But it's what happens, it isn't just that moment, it's about what are the ramifications of that thing that you're seeing, because there are ramifications way beyond what's in the frame.
Yeah.
And also the ramifications of what happens after a war has finished are as important and much more long-lasting, obviously, than the events during a conflict itself.
Yeah.
As you've got more and more of the photographer in their own work, that also is reflected in the way that photojournalism has moved somewhat away from the editorial market, or is less dependent on the editorial market now. And of course, within the editorial market, you have very little control over what you produce.
If you were to ask how I define myself now, I would simply say a photographer. But if I look at how my income is generated, I'm more an artist than a photojournalist. I mean, I get my money, apart from grants, it is more from print sales and exhibition fees than from publications. And I think the last time I had an assignment from a magazine must have been about 5 years ago. There are two main lines. If you look at my work of the last 10 years or so, and one is a worldwide comparison of elements that are vital in society, yet that very few people would photograph because they don't seem to be very photogenic. US was a disaster because nobody could tell me where to get a permission, and nobody was even answering. Like, you would send an email and you wouldn't hear anything. Send another email, no reply. At some point you find the person's phone number, so you call him. All right, shall I just briefly tell you what was in the email? Yeah, wonderful. Okay, yeah, that's a good idea. So you start explaining, and the guy says, well, you know what, send me an email. If you would drop all the other reasons why it's interesting to look at bureaucracy, it's also a very interesting way to portray a country.
The approach we take at Panos towards photographing in other parts of the world, particularly in somewhere like Africa, where photojournalists invariably make the mistake of either being Afro-pessimists or Afro-romantics. So, by which I mean, on the one hand, they want to portray the country as a basket case with just misery, destruction, grinding poverty, or on the other hand, where they take an ethnographic approach, a sort of man at one with nature and living in total harmony, both of which are fraught with problems, particularly the latter, because I think that kind of ethnographic approach is almost like something from the 19th century when we look at it now. But there's this whole middle area that is ignored by photojournalists. I mean, people in Africa, they live their lives, they have normal lives, they have the same desires, they enjoy the same things, they do the same things as anyone anywhere else. And I think this story by Chris Coylan of cycling of the Tour de Burkina Faso is a classic example of that. It's about bicycle racing. It happens to be in Burkina Faso, and from that you get a flavour of Burkina Faso.
Something I'm quite interested in is sometimes with photography and bodies of work of this ilk, is when you have a story that's actually about something more specific than just trying to cover a country or a conflict, as you look at an individual or you look at a certain event, but as maybe metaphor or representation of a bigger picture, it actually has more effect by focusing in.
Certainly. But I think people make the mistake of looking for the exotic. That's the other thing they're doing. They're always looking for the exotic, particularly when they're somewhere else. they're looking for the exotic. They miss the everyday, which is, they miss the important because they're looking for the exotic. And I think wherever possible, I encourage Panos photographers to look for the everyday, to look for what's important.
And trust that they will make it interesting.
Yeah, exactly.
Working at newspapers is very different to working on your own long-term projects. A newspaper, I think, gives you good discipline in meeting deadlines and in learning how to get the picture out quickly. But from a documentary sense, I think you do have to unlearn some things. It's not about the single image with long-term projects, whereas with newspapers, all they ever want is one picture, you know. I won the Luis Valtuena Humanitarian Photography Award, which is run by Médicos del Mundo, a Spanish NGO. The prize was a grant to cover one of their projects anywhere in the world. So they immediately presented me with a map and showed me their projects all over the world, and I saw Western Sahara instantly. And it was always a place that I was interested in Africa, because it's so obscure and so out of the media spotlight, that I said, yes, this is where I want to go. I didn't have any preconceived ideas. I mean, I really thought I could do something interesting during the day. The idea was a reaction to the situation I found, and I was just really shocked by, first of all, the numbers, and secondly, just how forgotten they are, you know. Nobody really knows that these people are there. I think it was after 3 or 4 days, I just thought, you know, I mean, it's like they're living in darkness here. Like, it's one long night for these people. So why don't I just shoot it all at night time? When I had the idea, it just instantly felt right.
What's interesting about the work that he produced in Western Sahara, and I think that's true of so much work now, is that there's so much more of the photographer that goes into creating photography now. I mean, I think if we look back here, these are kind of, they're not standard pictures. That would be doing them a disservice, but they are within a classic black and white photojournalism
language
style.
Yeah,
exactly. And it's a language and a language that some people find very difficult to give up, but it is a language that was.
But it's also a language, and it's a language we understand. Whereas I think going to these stylized, and they are stylized portraits, makes you really have to think a bit more than if they were on the hoof kind of.
I think there's more that the photographer has to think more about what they're trying to get across, what they're trying to say. How can they represent that visually?
There was a neighborhood not far from where I lived in Kabul, which had a really busy bus station across from the main courthouse. And at that bus station, there were about a half dozen box cameras set up. These large wooden boxes sitting on top of very heavy, rather awkward tripods. They create small black and white photo IDs of people who are coming and going, whether it's for a driver's license or some sort of registration. People come to this place for the sole purpose of having these small photos made, and they're made pretty much on the spot. As I was chatting with one of the photographers and watching the people as they came to sit to have their photos taken, I decided I wanted to see what the camera looked like on the inside, because the photographer kept opening the small door on the back of the camera, and I was really just curious. So when I looked inside, there was this amazing, beautifully lit reflection of the person who was having their portrait taken on the glass, on the inside of the camera. And because these cameras are not particularly well taken care of, they're old, the glass is old and textured, it's scratched, it's stained with chemicals, there was a really interesting quality on the glass on which the reflection of the person was captured. So I really just started to play around with that a little bit. I wanted to add some color to the background, because the background the photographers were using was always black, and that seemed just dull to me. I decided to use the chadors, the headscarves that women in Afghanistan wear. Those you can pretty much get at any market. I bought many different colors and I used them as a backdrop, and I also used my own headscarf, and this is where it actually gets kind of tricky. What I did was I let the light filter through the headscarf to get the colored reflected light, the kind of blurred light that you see on the glass.
This is a really good example of kind of complex imagery, and you have to almost know the process to get the power of the work. But the other thing that's really interesting in this, and this is documentary photography, not art photography, and yet it's about performance. Part of the work is her putting the veil on the camera. which, you know, that kind of performance and self-portrait, you know, or self-referential used to be, you know, the art world, and now this is in documentary photography.
Exactly. And that's that whole crossover that's happening.
I think, you know, collaborations, certainly in the way I work, are a very powerful way of putting a message across. It was really obvious from when we first arrived that the story was within the family members. You know, there was a lot of stuff coming out about the miners, and it was being quite widely reported because there was so many people there. But actually, you know, when you started speaking to the families about what they were going through, that seemed equally as harrowing and equally as traumatic. There were a lot of press there from all over the world. You know, everyone wanted to get a story. We were lucky because we were there for the duration of the whole thing, you know, nearly 6 weeks. So we had the time to really get to know people, and I think that's really essential. You know, we weren't just parachuting in for a couple of days. The government set up this system where family members and the miners could correspond with each other, and they sent these packages called doves, and a big metal chute would come up, and inside that chute there'd be packages of letters. You know, they were sending t-shirts down, fresh socks, underwear, bits of soap, you know, other kind of essentials, and even magazines and CDs and that sort of stuff. We couldn't physically go down into the mine, that was clear. But obviously the footage that was coming out, there was some great stuff, but it was all edited and controlled by the government. So, you know, we really wanted to kind of see from a first person perspective some really kind of unedited raw footage, you know, and there's only one way you could do it, and that was obviously through sending the camera down there. All the guys in the team were very clear that we didn't really want to give Edison any instructions. We had the camera down there for about 3 weeks, and we hadn't received the SIM card back up. We hadn't got it. The day before he got out, and this is when we really knew that they believed they were going to escape, he sent it up inside a pair of socks, and we got it. And seeing this guy who, you know, obviously was tormented but was finding his own way to deal with it, finding his own way through running for miles and through pulling, you know, bits of machinery around the mines. It was absolutely crazy, you know, seeing these pictures. And so by the time I actually got back to Santiago and then flew to New York, the pictures were already flying out all over the place, and it was just unbelievable the distance that they went. And it was fantastic to see that, you know, Panos were able to get them in front of so many people across the world.
The aesthetic of the picture is equally as important as the content.
Yes.
It's not just that you got down there. To be honest, the fact that it's gritty and kind of not particularly amazingly taken photographs actually adds to it. It becomes more real. But it's interesting that Panos will deal with these pictures because I see the importance of them as documents.
Yeah, it's a very important document. I mean, it's as much a historical document as the picture we discussed much earlier of the Saatchi and Saatchi poster on the Berlin Wall.
Yeah.
I mean, they're equally valid.
It's kind of, I love that idea of photography being a bit like pointing at something. Because you're saying, no, don't look over there, look over there. Yeah. And that's what Mishka Henner seems to do, is he's constantly just choosing what to point at.
Exactly. There's a tsunami of photography going on, and half of it it's produced and it's gone. He sort of sees his role more as that of an aggregator, someone who picks through the rubble and finds the threads that are there, that unless someone did it, you wouldn't actually know that there were any threads there.
Having worked in documentary for about 5 or 6 years in photography, social documentary, and realising that there's a whole discourse about photography going on all the time. Everybody's got an opinion about it. And I myself was starting to question what I was doing with photography. So I was interested in what other people had to say about it, really. Photography years came out of just gathering all these different opinions about it, and I really wasn't interested in the established voices of photography, but much more about what anyone had to say about it. So photography is kind of collapses any hierarchy of authority in talking about photography. So a phrase written by Susan Sontag might sit next to a phrase written by a 14-year-old blogger in Wisconsin, and the source is removed, so each statement has equal weight. So that was probably one of the first projects where I really started to work with the search engine. No Man's Land is a body of work that presents what appear to be a number of sex workers in and around Europe, all captured by Google Street View. Somebody is driving a car along these roads with a camera mounted on top of the car, which automatically takes 9 pictures every few seconds, all at different angles. I'm simply coming along and choosing one of those viewpoints and framing the shot so that it works. And in that sense, I see myself as working as a photographer. Google Street View in itself doesn't tell a story. It needs people to interpret it. It needs people to make sense out of the huge, vast amount of images that it produces. And I think that that's what I'm doing with No Man's Land. We kind of live in an era where the search engine is almost our main interface with the world. You know, we kind of we gather information about the world, we learn things, we look for things through the search engine. And so for me it makes perfect sense to work as a photographer using the search engine.
I think Panos photographers cover issues in a more in-depth way than a lot of the agencies. I mean, a lot of the other agencies may look at the more sensational stories, the bigger stories around the world, but with Panos what you see are stories often that you won't have heard of before, in places that are more remote, more secluded, and they really bring that out, you know, and cover those issues in a passionate way, and you can learn a lot from looking at a Panos website, and just those collection of stories that might be on the front page, very likely to be from issues that are neglected and that need exposure and need to be talked about.
I think it's why I'm a photographer and not a filmmaker. I like the fact that you just keep adding and that you know, there's no full stop.
When I look at that picture now, there's something wonderfully naive about it, in that is a Prime Minister in a controlled walkabout that was basically hijacked by real life. I couldn't take it today for a still photographer to be able to stand back and get a clean picture of real people with a leading politician in a real world situation is practically impossible because of the pressures on A, the spin doctors, but B, the rolling 24-hour news. To actually see a politician that hasn't got 14 fluffy microphone boons under their noses is quite a rare thing.
For me, it was being out on my own. Mm-hmm. And this kind of thing I got because I was not around other photographers. Mm-hmm. Very much somebody who likes to be out there documenting. I'm interested in history. So.
Well, this is a piece of history.
That's it. It's a historic photo. I think that's what I feel about it. It is a piece of history, yeah. And I was very lucky to get it.
I can sort of hear the banter. It wasn't aggressive, but it was slightly jeering. This picture was taken in 1986, before the 87 general election. It was against a background of recession, post-miners' strike, post the big shake-up of the media with Murdoch at Wapping.
Documentary's expanded so much.
Exactly.
I think the kind of work that I've been doing recently wouldn't have been called documentary 15 years ago, and now it fits within the umbrella of documentary.
No, it's exactly the same, I think. I still do trips on my credit card. I get some commissions and balance the two out.
The stories that people can tell to put with your visuals, I think can be a fantastic addition.
I no longer see a distinction really between going out and taking pictures of the world and going out and taking pictures from the world.
It's 25 years since Panos Pictures was founded as the commercial arm of the Panos Institute, an environment and development NGO. And it's that relationship that we have with the Panos Institute that has coloured what we've done over the last 25 years. The issues we choose to cover, our approach, the way we work. We sit between the not-for-profit world and the for-profit world, and it's that space that we occupy that makes us unique.
Where we were was much more working in a sort of single image environment, in a press environment. And this is a one-off.
The wall came down on 9th of November, and I remember that there were lots of photographers in London trying to get to Berlin at that time, and the flights were getting incredibly booked up, and then the price just escalated because all the staff photographers and the press agencies were throwing money over the counters to get their photographers out there. So I realised I wasn't going to make it. So I thought, I'll go at New Year. As I was walking down, approaching the Brandenburg Gate, you could see these letters Sa and Sa through some of the spaces in the columns. I thought, what? That can't be Saatchi and Saatchi. Is it possible, you know? It didn't appeal to me at all to be in a scrum of news photographers. I did it a few times. I hated it. What always appealed